Imagine standing at the edge of a forest in 1843. Behind you is everything you left: a farm in Virginia, a church where your parents were married, neighbors who knew your name. In front of you is nothing. Not nothing as in empty. Nothing as in wilderness. There were no roads, no buildings, no cleared land anywhere you could see. Just trees. Thousands of them, millions of them. A wall of oak and pine and hickory stretching to the horizon in every direction. And somewhere in that wall of timber, you're supposed to build a town. Not a cabin, a town. With streets and a general store and a church and a schoolhouse and homes for 50 families who are counting on you to figure this out. You have axes, you have saws, you have the clothes on your back, and maybe, if you were lucky, were a few pounds of iron nails that cost you 25 cents a pound back in St. Louis. That's it. That's what you're working with. The forest will have to provide everything else. This is how America actually got built. Not with supply chains and hardware stores and lumber yards. With trees. Just trees. And the hands of men and women who looked at an impossible task and started swinging anyway. What happened next would reshape a continent, but it would also kill more people than most wars. Because building a civilization from raw timber isn't just difficult, it's dangerous in ways that our modern minds can barely comprehend. So let's go back. Let's stand where they stood. Let's understand what it actually took to build a town from nothing but what the forest provided. And the first thing you need to understand is what these settlers were actually looking at when they arrived. We think of forests today as parks, nice places to hike, maybe some trails, some picnic areas, maybe a visitor center with a bathroom and a gift shop. The forests of frontier America were not parks. They were dark. Even at midday, the canopy was so thick that the forest floor existed in a kind of permanent twilight. Trees that had been growing for 300 years, 400 years. Some of them so large that 6 men holding hands couldn't reach around the trunk. The underbrush was so dense in places that you couldn't walk through it. You had to cut your way in. Every step forward meant hacking at vines and saplings and fallen branches that had been piling up for centuries. And the sounds, or rather, the absence of sounds. No church bells in the distance, no wagon wheels creaking on roads, no human voices carrying across fields. Just the creak of ancient trees swaying in wind you couldn't feel, the rustle of animals you couldn't see, the constant awareness that you were very small and very alone in something very, very large. This is what a family from Massachusetts was looking at when they decided to build a new life in Ohio. This is what a group of settlers from Pennsylvania faced when they reached the Indiana Territory. This is what thousands of Americans confronted every year for decades as the frontier pushed westward, and every single one of them had the same first thought: we need shelter tonight. That first night was the most dangerous. Without walls, without a roof, without fire in a contained space, you were exposed to everything the wilderness could throw at you. Rain that could soak you to the bone and bring on pneumonia, cold that could kill you by morning, animals that had never learned to fear humans because they'd never seen one. So the first structure wasn't really a structure at all, it was survival. You'd find the biggest tree you could, preferably one with a hollow at the base or thick roots that created natural walls on a few sides. You'd pile branches against it, you'd stuff leaves and moss into the gaps, you'd dig a small pit for a fire and pray the smoke would rise instead of filling your makeshift shelter. And you'd spend that first night listening to the forest, jumping at every sound, us knowing that everything you'd need to actually survive this place was standing around you in the form of trees you hadn't yet figured out how to turn into lumber. That transformation, trees into lumber, this was the fundamental challenge of frontier building. And it was far more complex than simply cutting things down. A tree is not a building material. A tree is a living organism filled with water and sap and irregular grain and branches that grew in whatever direction the sun told them to grow. It's curved where you need it straight. It's round where you need it flat. It's wet when you need it dry. Turning a tree into something you can build with requires removing all of these problems. And on the frontier, you had to do it with hand tools, limited knowledge, and a timeline measured in days before winter arrived. The first and most critical decision was which trees to cut. Not all wood is equal. Oak is strong but heavy and hard to work. Pine is soft and easy to cut, but rots quickly when exposed to weather. Hickory is nearly indestructible but so tough that it will dull your axe blade in an afternoon. Walnut is beautiful, but better saved for furniture than framing. The experienced woodsmen who led these expeditions knew these differences intuitively. They could look at a tree and tell you not just what species it was, but how old it was, how straight the grain would be, whether it had rot in the heartwood, whether it would split clean or tear ragged. This knowledge was the difference between a house that stood for 50 years and a house that collapsed in the first heavy snow. But even with the right trees selected, you still face the fundamental problem of getting them down and getting them processed. A large oak tree might weigh 20,000 pounds standing. Getting it on the ground safely required understanding physics that most settlers had learned through painful experience rather than formal education. Which direction would it fall? What was the lean? Were there widowmakers? Those dead branches high in the canopy that could break loose when the tree started moving and kill you before you even heard them coming? The term widowmaker wasn't a figure of speech. Men died regularly from these falling branches. They died from miscalculated falls that sent trees in unexpected directions. They died from saw blades that kicked back, from axe heads that flew off handles, from exhaustion that led to carelessness. The forest killed its share of those who came to cut it down. Consider what it meant to swing an axe for 10 hours in a day. The average logging axe weighed between 3 and 5 pounds. A good sawyer might take 100 swings to fell a single tree. Multiply that by the dozens of trees needed for a single cabin, and you begin to understand the physical toll. Arms that ached so badly you couldn't lift them by evening. Blisters that broke and bled and then hardened into calluses thick as leather. Backs twisted from lifting logs that weighed hundreds of pounds. And the cold. Much of the heaviest timber cutting happened in winter when the sap was down and the ground was frozen hard enough to drag logs across. Men worked in temperatures that froze their breath into ice on their beards. They swung axes with hands so numb they couldn't feel the handle. They drank from canteens that had to be kept inside their coats to keep the water from freezing solid. This was the life. Day after day. Week after week. Until the trees were down and the lumber was cut and the buildings could rise. 2 men with a crosscut saw could bring down a medium-sized tree in an hour of hard labor. A large tree might take half a day. And a single house, just one house, required about 10,000 board feet of finished lumber. Think about what that means. 10,000 board feet. That's enough wood to cover a football field to a depth of about 2.5 inches. All of it cut by hand. All of it processed by hand. All of it carried and stacked and dried and measured and cut again and fitted together by hand. For one house. And you're trying to build a town. This is why the sawyer was the most important man in any new settlement. More important than the preacher. More important than the doctor, if you even had one. More important than anyone except maybe the blacksmith. The sawyer was the man who could turn raw logs into usable lumber. And his sawmill was always, without exception, the first real structure built in any frontier town. Some settlements didn't even build cabins first. They'd live in tents or lean-tos for weeks while the sawmill went up. Because without the sawmill, you couldn't build anything else. You were stuck hand-hewing every board, splitting every plank, shaping every beam with nothing but axes and wedges and muscle. The earliest sawmills were simple affairs: a wooden frame, a saw blade that you'd brought with you from back east. And because you certainly couldn't make one in the wilderness, a water wheel if you were lucky enough to settle near a reliable stream. Or, if you weren't that lucky, a pit saw arrangement that required one man standing in a hole while another stood above, pulling a long saw blade up and down through the log while sawdust rained into the eyes and mouth of the man below. Pit sawing was brutal work. The man in the pit, called the pitman, worked in a cloud of sawdust in a hole that was often muddy, cold, and cramped. He pulled down on every stroke while the man above, the top sawyer, pulled up, hour after hour, day after day, producing maybe 200 board feet of lumber in a full day of labor. At that rate, sawing the lumber for a single house took 50 days of work for 2 men, and they had to build a town. This is why water-powered sawmills changed everything. A mill driven by a water wheel could produce 1,000 board feet per day, 2,000 if the wheel was large enough and the operator skilled enough. Suddenly, what had taken months could be accomplished in weeks. But even with the sawmill running, the lumber coming off the saw had a problem that no amount of mechanical advantage could solve. It was green. Green lumber is wood that's still full of the moisture it contained when it was alive. And green lumber does something that will make a modern carpenter cringe. It moves. As green lumber dries, it shrinks. But it doesn't shrink evenly. The outside dries faster than the inside. The ends dry faster than the middle. Different parts of the grain dry at different rates. The result is wood that twists, warps, cups, and cracks as it releases moisture. Build a house with green lumber and watch what happens over the next 6 months. Boards that were flat when you nailed them start to cup and curl. Joints that were tight start to gap. Walls that were square start to lean. Shingles that were flat start to curl at the edges, creating gaps where rain can get in. The old-timers back east knew to season their lumber. Cut it in winter when the sap was down. Stack it in a dry place with spacers between the boards so air could circulate. Wait at least a year, preferably 2, before using it for anything important. The frontier didn't have a year. The frontier had maybe 4 months before winter, and people needed shelter now. So they built with green lumber and accepted the consequences. Cabins that settled and shifted. Floors that developed gaps wide enough to lose a spoon through. Doors that stuck in summer and rattled in winter as the wood expanded and contracted with the seasons. This is why so many frontier buildings look crooked in old photographs. They weren't built crooked, they moved. And then there was the problem of fastening it all together. We take nails for granted today. You can buy a 5-pound box at any hardware store for a few dollars. But on the frontier in the 1830s, nails were precious. Cut nails, the flat tapered nails that were standard at the time, cost about 25 cents per pound. Doesn't sound like much until you realize that a typical house might need 20 or 30 pounds of nails, and a frontier family might earn less than $200 in a full year of farming. So they used as few nails as possible. For major structural connections were done with mortise and tenon joints, the same joints that furniture makers used. A rectangular hole carved into one piece of wood, a matching rectangular tongue shaped on another piece. Fit them together and the wood holds itself. For joints that needed to be pinned, they used tree nails. That's spelled like tree nails, but pronounced trunnels. These were wooden pegs, usually made from a harder wood than the boards they were joining. Oak pegs into pine boards, for example. You drill a hole through both pieces, drive the peg through, and then split the end of the peg and drive a small wedge into the split to lock everything in place. A well-made tree nail joint could be stronger than a nailed joint. Wood flexes with wood. A wooden peg and a wooden beam moves the same way the beam moves. Iron nails are rigid. They can work loose over time as the wood around them expands and contracts. But making tree nails took time. Each one had to be whittled from a billet of hardwood, smoothed, dried, and sized to fit the holes it would be driven into. A skilled worker might make 50 or 100 in a day. A house needed several hundred. Every step of this process, every single step, required human labor and human skill and human time. And the clock was always ticking toward winter. Let me give you a sense of the timeline these people were working against. A family arriving in May, which was the ideal time to start, had roughly 6 months before the first hard freeze. In that time, they needed to clear enough land to build on, build at least a basic shelter, clear enough additional land to plant a garden, plant that garden, tend it through summer, harvest it, preserve the food, gather firewood, and prepare for a winter that could last 5 months. If they arrived in July, which many did, they had 4 months. Maybe less. This is why frontier buildings were simple. Not because the settlers lacked ambition or skill, but because they lacked time. A log cabin, which could be raised in a week with the help of neighbors, was a survival decision. Beauty could wait. Comfort could wait. Getting through the winter alive could not wait. The log cabin itself was a particular form of engineering adapted to the American wilderness. The basic concept was simple. Stack logs horizontally, notch them at the corners so they lock together, fill the gaps with whatever you have. But the execution required more knowledge than most people realize. The logs needed to be reasonably straight and roughly the same diameter. Crooked logs created gaps. Logs of wildly different sizes created weak points where smaller logs sat on larger ones. The notching had to be precise. Too loose and the cabin would be drafty and unstable. Too tight and the logs would crack as they dried. The best builders used a technique called saddle notching, where each log had a curved groove cut into its underside that fit over the rounded top of the log below. This created a stable, self-draining joint that shed water instead of collecting it. The gaps between logs, called chinking, were filled in stages. First, small sticks and pieces of wood were wedged into the gaps to take up most of the space. Then a mixture of clay, mud, lime if you had it, and sometimes animal hair was pressed into the remaining gaps from both inside and outside. This chinking had to be renewed every year because it cracked and fell out as the building settled and the seasons changed. A cabin built this way could go up remarkably fast. The famous cabin raising was a real thing, a community event where every able-bodied person in the area would gather to help a new family get their walls up in a single day. The logs would be cut and prepared in advance. Teams of men would lift them into place, others would notch, others would begin chinking even as the walls went higher. By nightfall, if everything went well, a family that had been sleeping under a canvas tarp could be sleeping under a roof. A crude roof, perhaps. A dirt floor, certainly. No glass in the window openings. Just oiled paper or nothing at all. But walls, a door, something between them and the wilderness. This was the first generation of buildings, survival structures. They were dark, smoky, drafty, and crowded. A cabin measuring 16 by 20 feet might house a family of 8. Everyone slept in the same room. Everyone dressed in the same room. Privacy was a luxury that would have to wait for prosperity. But these cabins were only the beginning. Because a cabin is not a town. A town needs streets. It needs a general store where people can buy what they can't make. It needs a blacksmith to repair tools and shoe horses. It needs a church, or at least a building that can serve as a church on Sundays and a schoolhouse during the week. It needs a mill to grind grain. It needs a tavern where travelers can sleep and men can drink, and news from the outside world can be shared. And every single one of these buildings had to be built from the same source, the forest. As a settlement grew past the initial survival phase, the buildings got more sophisticated. The second generation of structures used sawn lumber instead of round logs. They had proper windows, maybe even glass if someone had managed to transport it from the east. They had wooden floors instead of dirt. They had separate rooms for sleeping, cooking, and living. But they were still made entirely of wood. The streets were mud. Awful, sucking mud that could pull a boot right off your foot in spring, freeze into ankle-breaking ruts in winter, and bake into choking dust in summer. So they built wooden streets. These were the famous boardwalks of the frontier, and they weren't decorative. They were survival infrastructure, raised wooden platforms built from the same lumber that built everything else, allowing people to walk above the mud instead of through it. Building a boardwalk seems simple until you actually think about the engineering involved. The wood is in direct contact with the ground. Water pools beneath it. Mud splashes up onto it. Every footstep, every wagon wheel, every horse hoof beats down on the same boards day after day. A well-built boardwalk in a frontier town might last 5 years. A poorly built one might need replacing every year. And while it was being replaced, people went back to walking in the mud. The fences were wood. The bridges were wood. The signs were wood. The water troughs for horses were made from hollowed logs. The gutters, such as they were wooden troughs. The hitching posts were wood. The town flagpole was wood. If you stood in the middle of a frontier town in 1850 and looked in any direction, almost everything you saw was made of wood. The only exceptions might be a few iron tools, some glass windows, and the clothes on people's backs. This created a certain visual consistency that we find quaint in old photographs. But it also created a problem so severe that it shaped the development of American cities for the next century. Fire, wood burns. This is obvious. But the implications of building entire cities out of wood, with open flames as the primary source of heat and light, with no fire departments and no fire hydrants and no building codes, were catastrophic. Let me tell you about Peshtigo. October 8th, 1871, the same day as the Great Chicago Fire, which killed around 300 people and destroyed much of the city. Everyone knows about the Chicago Fire. The story about Mrs. O'Leary's cow, probably false, has become American legend. But on that same day, 1,200 miles to the north, in a small lumber town in Wisconsin called Peshtigo, something far worse was happening. Peshtigo was a lumber town. That's not a metaphor. The town existed because of lumber. It had sawmills. It had a woodenware factory. It had boarding houses for loggers. And it was surrounded by forests that had been partially logged, leaving huge piles of slash, the branches and treetops and scraps that are left behind when you take only the good timber. The summer of 1871 had been dry. Drought, dry. Like the kind of dry where the moss on the forest floor crunches when you walk on it. Small fires had been burning in the surrounding woods for weeks, the normal result of land clearing operations and logging debris. On October 8th, the wind shifted and picked up. The small fires merged. And what happened next is still not fully understood. Witnesses described a wall of fire moving faster than a horse could run, trees exploding from the heat before the flames even reached them, a sound like 1,000 freight trains, a firestorm that created its own weather, sucking in air from all directions to feed its hunger for oxygen, then shooting that air straight up in a column that could be seen from hundreds of miles away. Peshtigo was built entirely of wood. Every building, every sidewalk, every fence. The fire arrived and the town simply ceased to exist. Not burned, vaporized. Some bodies were found completely intact, killed by the superheated air before the flames even touched them. Others were never found at all. Between 1,200 and 2,500 people died in the Peshtigo fire. The exact number is unknown because the records burned too. It remains the deadliest fire in American history, and nobody remembers it because it happened the same day as the Chicago Fire, and Chicago was a bigger city with better communications with the outside world. This is what building with wood meant on the frontier. Not might happen, did happen, over and over again, across the country, for decades. San Francisco burned to the ground 6 times before 1851. 6 times. And they rebuilt in wood each time. Well, because what else were they going to use? Bricks had to be shipped around Cape Horn. Stone had to be quarried and transported. Wood was right there. The fire of 1851 finally destroyed so much of San Francisco that they started building with brick. But by then, thousands of buildings had been consumed. Hundreds of people had died. Fortunes had been made and lost and made again, all to fire. Virginia City, Nevada, Deadwood, South Dakota, Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, Jacksonville, Florida. The list of major frontier towns that burned, some of them multiple times, is longer than most people realize. And each time they rebuilt, often in the same materials, because the trees were right there, and the alternative was not building at all. This brings us to 1833, and a man named Augustine Taylor, an invention that would change everything. Taylor was a carpenter in Chicago, which was barely a town at the time. He was trying to figure out how to build a church, St. Mary's Church, with limited skilled labor and limited time. The traditional method of building a frame structure required heavy timbers, sometimes 8 by 8 inches or larger, joined together with complex mortise and tenon joints cut by skilled carpenters. Each joint might take hours to cut. A single wall frame might have a dozen such joints. And raising these heavy frames into position required teams of men and elaborate systems of ropes and braces. Taylor had a different idea. Instead of heavy timbers with complex joints, he used light framing lumber, roughly 2 inches by 4 inches, joined together with nothing but nails. Instead of a few massive structural members, he used many small ones, close together, sharing the load. People laughed at him. They called it a balloon frame, because they said a strong wind would blow it away like a balloon. They were wrong. The balloon frame was actually stronger than traditional timber framing, pound for pound. The many small members distributed stress more evenly than a few large ones. If one piece failed, the others could take up the load. And because the pieces were light enough for one man to handle, You didn't need a team to raise walls. A single carpenter could build an entire house by himself. The implications changed everything. A house that would have taken a team of skilled carpenters months to build using traditional framing could now be built by 1 or 2 men in weeks. The lumber could be cut at the mill to standard dimensions 2x4, 2x6, 2x8, eliminating the need to custom fit every piece. The only joinery required was nailing, a skill that almost anyone could learn in a day. The balloon frame spread across the frontier like fire. By the 1850s, it had become the standard method of wood construction in America. Towns that would have taken years to build with traditional methods could now spring up in months. This was the technology that built the American West. Not the railroad, though that helped. Not the telegraph, though that connected things. The balloon frame, cheap, fast, and requiring nothing but lumber and nails. A man with an axe, a saw, and a bag of nails could build a house. He could build it on land that had been forest a month before. He could build it without skilled help. He could build it in time to get through the winter. The balloon frame made American expansion possible in a way that no other technology did. Think about what this meant for the average settler. Before the balloon frame, building a proper house required hiring skilled craftsmen or developing those skills yourself over years of apprenticeship. You needed to understand the complex geometry of timber framing. You needed the strength to maneuver heavy beams into position. You needed the tools, the time, and the help of many hands. After the balloon frame, you needed a hammer, some nails, and a pile of 2x4s. The democratization of building was complete. A farmer could build his own house, a storekeeper could put up his own shop, a congregation could raise their own church. The skills that had been jealously guarded by guilds for centuries were suddenly available to anyone with basic manual competence. This is why the American landscape looks the way it does. All those little houses with their simple gable roofs and their white clapboard siding. All those farmhouses scattered across the prairies. All those small town main streets with their identical wooden storefronts. They weren't designed by architects. They were built by ordinary people using a system simple enough that anyone could learn it. The balloon frame wasn't just a construction technique. It was the skeleton of American democracy, the physical manifestation of a society that believed anyone could build their own future, literally, with their own hands. But it was still wood, and wood still burned. The Chicago Fire of 1871, the famous one, when tore through a city built almost entirely of balloon frame structures. Over 17,000 buildings destroyed, 300 people dead, 100,000 homeless in a single night. And here's the thing that modern audiences often miss. They knew. They knew it was dangerous. They knew that building entire cities out of wood, heating them with open fires, lighting them with oil lamps, was a recipe for disaster. They knew because they'd seen it happen before, in other cities, in their own neighborhoods. They did it anyway. Not because they were stupid, not because they didn't care about the risk, because they had no alternative that made sense economically. Brick was expensive, stone was more expensive, and neither brick nor stone was readily available on the frontier. Wood was right there, free for the taking, already being cleared to make room for farms. The choice wasn't between safe buildings and dangerous buildings. The choice was between dangerous buildings and no buildings at all. Between imperfect shelter and sleeping outside in the snow, between a town that might burn and no town at all. This is the calculation that the frontier imposed on everyone who went there. You accepted risks that would be unthinkable today because the alternative was death by other means. Exposure, starvation, the 1,000 dangers of trying to survive without shelter in a wilderness that didn't care whether you lived or died. So they built with wood, they heated with fire, they lit their way with flames, and they took their chances. Let's talk about what's been lost. I don't mean the buildings. Most frontier buildings are long gone. Replaced by structures made of steel and concrete and engineered materials that the original settlers couldn't have imagined. The ones that survive are carefully preserved in museums or historic districts, protected from the fires and rot and decay that claim their peers. I mean the knowledge, the skills, the intimate understanding of wood that came from working with it every day, all day, for an entire lifetime. The old-time sawyers and carpenters knew things about wood that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. They could look at a standing tree and tell you how the boards cut from it would behave 20 years in the future. They could feel the grain under their tools and know whether to push harder or ease off. They could smell the sawdust and tell you what species they were cutting, whether the tree had been healthy, and whether the wood would be stable or troublesome. This wasn't magic. It was expertise built through repetition. Thousands of hours, tens of thousands of hours, a lifetime of paying attention to a single material, learning its moods and tendencies, developing an intuition that no textbook could teach. We don't build that kind of expertise anymore. We don't need to. Our buildings are engineered by computers and assembled from materials manufactured to precise specifications. A construction worker today might never touch raw wood at all, just processed products that arrive on site ready to install. This is progress. It's faster, cheaper, safer, and more reliable. A modern house will outlast a frontier cabin by decades, if not centuries. The roof won't leak, the walls won't shift. The floors won't develop gaps wide enough to lose a fork through. But something has been lost. Some connection to the material world that the old builders had and we don't. They knew where their walls came from. They knew the trees those walls had been. They knew the forest those trees had grown in because they'd walked it, felled it, processed it with their own hands. We know our walls came from a truck. Stand in an old-growth forest sometime, if you can find one. Put your hand on the bark of a tree that's been growing since before the American Revolution. Feel the roughness of it. Smell the resin. Listen to the creak of branches that have been reaching for the sun for 300 years. Now imagine looking at that tree and seeing not beauty but building material, not wonder but work. Not a natural monument, but the walls of your house, the beams of your barn, the boards of your floor. All of it locked inside that trunk, waiting for you to extract it with nothing but an axe and a saw and the strength of your arms. That's what they saw. Every day. For generations. They looked at the forest and saw a town. We look at a town and try to imagine the forest. The debt we owe these builders is hard to calculate. Every city west of the Appalachians exists because someone once stood at the edge of a wilderness and decided to start cutting. Every road, every bridge, every structure built before the Civil War, and many built long after, was made possible by men and women who knew how to turn trees into civilization. They didn't have power tools. They didn't have truck deliveries. They didn't have YouTube tutorials explaining how to cut a mortise and tenon joint. They had axes. They had saws. They had the knowledge passed down from their parents and grandparents, modified by their own experience, refined through their own mistakes. And they built a nation. It wasn't easy. It wasn't safe. And it certainly wasn't free of cost. The graveyards of frontier towns tell a story that the history books often skip. The young men crushed by falling trees, the children who burned when the cabin caught fire, the entire families who didn't make it through the first winter because the shelter wasn't finished in time, or the chinking wasn't thick enough, or the roof leaked where the shingles had curled. Building a civilization from raw timber wasn't just hard work, it was dangerous work. And the workers who did it deserve more than the romantic gloss we usually give them. They deserve to be remembered as what they were. Engineers working at the edge of human capability, inventors creating solutions to problems no one had solved before, laborers performing feats of endurance that would break most modern bodies in days, and above all, pragmatists. People who did what had to be done because the alternative was not doing it, and not doing it meant not surviving. The next time you drive through a small town in Ohio or Indiana or Wisconsin, take a moment to look at the buildings. The old ones, if there are any left. The ones with clapboard siding and wood frame windows, and maybe, if you look closely, the hand-cut profiles that mark them as products of another age. Those buildings came from trees, and trees that grew in forests that no longer exist, cut by hands that turned to dust a century ago, joined together by skills that most living carpenters have never learned. Those buildings are monuments, not to architecture or design or style, to survival, to the human capacity to look at an impossible task and find a way to do it anyway, to the willingness to accept terrible risks because the alternative was accepting certain failure. The frontier is closed now, has been for over a century. We don't need to build towns from scratch in the wilderness anymore. But the towns are still here, the roads are still here, the nation those builders carved out of the forest is still here, built from nothing but trees and hand tools, and the extraordinary will of ordinary people who refuse to let the impossible stop them. That's the story. That's the real story of how America got built. Not with grand plans and industrial machinery and government programs, with axes, with saws, with arms that ached and backs that broke and spirits that somehow kept going when every reasonable calculation said to quit. Next time someone tells you that Americans have lost our ability to do hard things, remind them where we came from. We came from the forest, and we turned it into a civilization, one tree at a time,